I'd like to welcome you to the third session of our Winter Next Destination Speaker Series. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I want to thank Nan Allen from the Springboro Public Library also, for our partnership going on 6 years, I believe. Thank you for helping to put this programming together. Also, Joe McKenzie from Miami Valley Cable Council, Communications Council, for the video, which will be available for rebroadcast. And also in the back, Jason Vogel doing the sound and light. Can you get the light out of my eyes? I'm kidding. And also Maureen Russell Hodson, as always, for all your help. I want to recognize a member of our Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, Cindy Sitzman. You don't have to raise your hand. BPAC is responsible for all the programming and projects that we're doing here in Springboro. So tonight's program is being recorded for rebroadcast on YouTube. You don't have to have cable, or on the city website. I think it's also rebroadcast on Channel 6. So you'll be able to catch it that way as well. So you can ask a very good question. You'll be on TV forever. So just remember that. With that in mind, wherever it is, please turn off your phones and other devices. Thank you. When we get to the question and answer period of the session, please bear with me. We'll ask to have the question rebroadcast or pronounced so that we can get it on the tape here. So please bear with us. Before we talk about Steve tonight, make sure you get your card. We have one more speaker tonight as part of the series, I should say, and that is on Monday, February 20th. We're going to have Dr. Jocelyn Hardman talking about St. Cuthbert's Way. It's not a way of life, but it's a trail that's in I guess it's a way of life, but it's a trail in Scotland, in northeast England. Great speaker. She was here last year talking about hiking in Spain. It'll be a really good program. So please come back here, 6:30 here at Performing Arts Center. So let me get out of the way so Steve can talk, and he will have plenty of time for questions. Steve Magas, I think this is your third time here in Springboro.
I was looking it up. I think it's my third time.
So Steve's here.
Once in a tiny room, once in an empty room, and now this. This is good.
So we're
moving up.
We're moving up. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight to hear Steve speak again. Steve's been a trial lawyer since 1982 and has been doing bike law pretty much almost since that time, and in private practice on his own since 2009. He's a member of the board of the Ohio Bike Federation, so he helped in part, among other projects and initiatives, get going the 3-foot rule, which was adopted 3 or 4 years ago. And I am going to turn it over to Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I passed out some cards, so I hope everybody got some cards, or it should be a crash card and a law card. And so not only do those have my very important phone number, 484-BIKE, on them, but there's some interesting information. So like I always do in the beginning of these things, my wife couldn't be here, so I told her, I'll take a picture. So everybody say, "Hi, Lisa." So my name is Steve Magas. I'm an attorney. I've been a cyclist for a long time. And give you a sense of how long. Well, this is one of my current bikes. It's an independent fabrication. I found it on Craigslist in Minnesota in a barn. And I was looking for an independent fabrication, and it wasn't painted like this in the barn. So I found it. This fellow bought it for his dad. He was a club racer, and he was selling it for about half of what the frame would cost. And I thought, all right, so I talked with him. He shipped it to Mitch at Bio Wheels. Mitch checked it out. It's like, this bike's never been ridden. There's nubbies on the tires, and there's no grease on the chain. It just was hanging in this guy's barn. So I had it painted and branded, and it shows up in my ad so I can, deduct the cost of a bicycle. But that's one of them. And then the other one we also branded. That's our brand on the, I have an orange Bike Friday, which I was going to bring and I wasn't going to bring, and then it seemed like it might be a hassle to bring, but I saw one out there, so I don't know whose that is, but that's pretty cool. And my first kind of real bike was a Schwinn Continental from about 1974. And I talk about Schwinn a little bit in a bit here, and how they kind of brought the life back to the bicycle world. but this is kind of then and now sort of that guy I don't know who that guy is over there, but around 77, my buddy and I, we always try to do something goofy in the summertime. So one year we took his dad's canoe and we put it in the Kokosing River, and we thought we were going to have this multi-day, canoe expedition down the mighty Kokosing, and didn't realize in that hot summer the water was so low that we had to hike the canoe more than we rode it. But that was fun. But then we thought, it's not that far to Canada, so we ought to put our bikes together and we'll go up to Canada. We'll take the Pelee Islander from Sandusky across, and so that was my takeoff. We didn't have those fancy French pannier things, we didn't know what we were doing. So I put 40 pounds of stuff in a backpack, an old Army cotton knapsack. We had our tent, sleeping bags, cans of food, that we would open on the trail somewhere, and my little bag in the back was the only one we had. My dad shot that right before we left, and I can't imagine why the Canadian Border Police pulled us out of the line of tourists, you and you. They took us to the room with a 40-foot table, and they opened the packs up and spread everything out. But and that's the Bike Friday of today. So Chris Carville and Chris is, I have a theory now after this. Never get your picture taken with a skinny guy. But Chris is a rider. He races, rides. He's about 50. And he and we've made him the Kentucky bike lawyer, and I'm the Ohio bike lawyer. And Chris and I tag team cases in Ohio and Kentucky. We settled one for a little over $1 million in Kentucky earlier last year. So we've had some good success tag teaming cases together, and he has a similar background to mine. And then he helped me put the bike law card together, because we have the Ohio laws on one side, Kentucky laws on the other. And then we also do the crash cards as well. You can find our information on them. So like I say, 9 to 5, my job is basically representing cyclists. I have 50, 60 cases percolating from here to Cleveland, Bellefontaine to Marietta through the day. And then 9 to 5 is that, and 5 to 9 is sort of the advocacy stuff. I sit on the board of the Ohio Bicycle Federation. I work with the local clubs and with clubs in Dayton and around the state, and then work on the LAB national. There's like a little legal committee that we get involved in things from time to time nationally as well. And then, like, instead of the Ride of Silence, this year we had I think they called it the Remembrance Action Ride, because the Tri-State Trails folks wanted to change it up a little bit and become more, we recognize the people, as the Ride of Silence does, who were killed and injured over the course of the year, but we also wanted to make it more of an action ride to get some stuff done. So we rode from downtown Cincinnati, we rode to Cincinnati City Hall, we went across the river and hit Covington and Newport City Halls, and because and there had just been a recent problem on the bridge connecting the cities, and it was raining like all get out, but we had a small but hearty group that made it that night. So the main theme I try to push, because I'm usually the gloom and doom guy, I handle bike crashes, fatal crashes. I have a nonprofit called the BCRC Bicycle Crash Research Center, and we look at every single fatal crash on a bicycle in Ohio. And I started that about a decade ago because in looking at, I was a math major, I got a math degree back in the day, and I always liked looking at the numbers and the data and the statistics and all that. And it's like, well, usually there's 15 or 16 fatal crashes in Ohio. I could probably look at all of them in pretty much detail, and because the crash reports in a fatal crash tend to be not 3 or 4 pages, but 70 or 80 pages, we can probably get all of that through public records, and we would work up each crash as though we were handling it, and then see what happened, see did the police get it right. Did they do a good investigation? Was there any criminal prosecution? Was it the bicyclist's fault? Was it the motorist's fault? Was it some fault of the road or an animal or whatever? We try to sort out whether the police analyzed it correctly, and we've been doing that for a decade. And I've been kind of footing the bill for that. And then we created the BCRC, which is a 501c3, and we're trying to get a little money. We got $1,000 from OBF to kind of offset some of the costs. You're going to be seeing and hearing a little bit about that in the future if you follow me or the sort of bicycle statistical world. But the thing I try to come in here and say is bicycling is safe. I mean, we have a lot of riders in Ohio, a lot of riders nationwide. People ride hundreds of millions of miles each year. And every once in a while, at the far end of the bell curve, where I live, something happens, and then we have to look at it, we have to do something about it. But by and large, riding on the roads and riding on trails is a very safe endeavor. And we'll look at some of the numbers here in a minute. The safety part, you know, I don't know if you ever read Mark Twain's essay about riding a bike, but he wrote a very nice essay about learning to ride a big wheel, you know, the old-fashioned style bike. I picked this meme up off the internet, and of course they got it wrong because he didn't ride a bike like this. But his last line is, get a bicycle, you won't regret it if you live. Because he fell a lot in his early times. So how many riders are out there? It looks like the best numbers we have is about 45 million, about 13.5% of the population rides bikes. Here's some numbers from just the last couple of years from the sporting goods world, where they're saying 44.47 million people riding bikes, and it bumped up considerably from 2019 to 2020. Not surprising, because in that same time frame, COVID bumped up and bumped us off of our normal routines, and bike people sold every bike they could get through the market pretty much, and people started riding bikes like crazy again. And that's continuing. That's been part of a boom in bicycling that's been for the last decade or so. But the COVID era really ramped up the bicycling. Unfortunately, it also ramped up some of the fatal crash data. This is very hard to read, but NHTSA, which is the National Highway Transportation Safety Authority, puts this out. And what this is states in alphabetical order, tells you how many fatalities in each state on the road in general, traffic fatalities. Then there's cyclist fatalities, and it tells you what percentage of the total fatalities are made up of bicyclists who were killed. And then they do the same thing. There's the population, and then they tell you about how many cyclists per 100,000 people. So it gives you a way of sort of evaluating state by state safety. So if you look at Ohio, we're at 1.5%. When in that year, I'm not sure if this was 19 or 2020, we had 18 fatalities and cyclists, 1,230 people. So over 1,000 people are killed in Ohio on the road in cars every year. That year there were 18. I lost it. Oh, there we are. Yeah, 18. That's 1.5%. And then when you look at our population, people don't realize Ohio is the 7th largest state in the union. We have 11.7 almost million people. Our rate per 100,000 people, so for every 100,000 people in Ohio, the rate is 0.15. You go down to the average is 0.28, so we're almost at half the average, which makes us, on the safety scale, the bigger that number is, the more dangerous the roads are, because more people per 100,000 are being killed. You look at Florida, which leads the league in this department. Florida had 3,300 people killed on their traffic deaths. 170 of those, 10 times our state. 170 were cyclists. They have 21 million people, so they're not quite twice as many people. And they had 0.78 of people killed per 100,000 people. So they're 4.5 times of what Ohio is in terms of safety and danger. It's hard to compare state to state, city to city, but if you look at it from a population perspective, Ohio is very safe, and we're one of the safest states when it comes to this. This is another way of looking at the same numbers. The darker the state, the more dangerous the state, or the higher the fatality rate in that state. And so where you see sometimes states get a high number because they just don't have a lot of people, so the difference between 1 and 2 and 3 fatalities kicks their number up dramatically. 1 or 2 in Florida doesn't matter because they had 180 people killed, but if you're in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, that makes a big difference. But the big 3 are generally Texas, California, and Florida. Those are the 3 most populous states. California and Florida have very high numbers of fatalities relative to the population. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. Weather may be one. They have more riding months of the year. You know, we don't ride necessarily 12 months of the year. Some people do, but in Ohio. But you know, a lot of the times we ride from May, April, March through September, October. So there's probably 3 or 4 or 5 months people aren't riding as much. But our numbers comparatively are very good when you compare fatality rates around the country. This is there's a lot of numbers on this page. Don't try to look at it. Just the point of this is every fatality number in the United States from 1994 to 2020. It tells you how many fatal crashes there were in total, and it breaks it down by drivers, passengers, and then you go down to the cyclists and the pedestrians. These are the ones that are important. On my longer presentation, I walk through numbers in more detail. If you look at national fatality numbers, in the 1970s was the worst decade that we have numbers for. And in the 80s, the number average, if you go just the average number of fatalities in the United States in the 80s was less than the 70s. 90s, less than the 80s. 2000s, less than the 90s. You see that here. It goes from 894, 800, 700, 700, 6666, 776. And then here, these 2 years, 2008-9 were at the low point, or actually 2007, I think. And then there's a reversal, and the numbers get higher and higher and higher and higher. Now we had 938 fatalities in 2020. You see the same kind of data with regard to pedestrians. The numbers go down, they go down, they go down. Here they bottom out around that same time frame, and gee, they start climbing again. Why? Well, I think there's a master's thesis waiting to be written on that, and I'll show you a couple things in a minute on that. But if you add up all those numbers, how many fatalities from 94 to 2020, over 1 million people in the United States were killed due to stupid, careless driving. I mean, they weren't murdered, they weren't, but you know, you can argue maybe they were, but they were just drivers, and ones and twos at a time, people picked off by stupid people driving 2-ton bowling balls, and all of a sudden, 1 million people have been killed on roads. In Ohio, each year, 300,000 crashes. Cars hit other cars. You know, car drivers like to whine about cyclists. You know, they run red lights and, you know, they do this and they do that and they don't stop and they don't follow the rules. And there's 300,000 people running into stuff that aren't bikes. You know, 500,000 Ohioans are involved in car versus car crashes. Over 1,000 of them are killed. And how many riders are there in Ohio, do we think? Well, if we go back to that original number, about 13.5% of our population, that's almost 1.5 million or 1.6 million Ohioans ride their bikes on a regular basis. How many crashes do you think there are in Ohio involving cars and bikes? And how many fatal crashes do you think they are, knowing 300,000 people run their cars into other cars? How many of them run into bikes, and how many cyclists are killed in Ohio each year? And the numbers are small. We have millions of riders. We have about 1,500 car versus bike crashes in Ohio. 16 to 17, that number's going up like the rest of them, but that's a pretty good approximation of how many fatalities we have of cyclists killed on the roads in Ohio. We want 0, but again, Ohio is one of the safest states. So as I said before, the numbers have been going down in the 70s to the 80s, 80s to 90s, and then something changed. Deaths in pedestrians and cyclists have been on the upswing. Right now, in the last decade, 800 cyclists a year. It was down much lower than that. A decade earlier was 700. So something's going on. Either we're becoming much worse at riding our bikes than we were a decade ago, and walking, or maybe something else is going on. What else was happening in that 2008-9 time frame? What was going on? that, you know, might have, oh, look at that, Apple released a phone, 2007, and a new one in 2008, and oh, look at that, you go over here to Facebook, in 2008, that many people were using Facebook, and then, you know, the number is unbelievable today. Same thing with Twitter, same thing with Instagram. Nobody used Instagram, but now, you know, if you're doing something and you're not snapping a picture and putting it on the social media as you're driving down the road, then, you know, you're not cool, I guess. What else might be causing fatalities? There's an article on NPR, more cyclists being killed by cars. Advocates say U.S. streets are a problem. And there is a very strong argument to be made that the way we have chosen to live and design our neighborhoods and our streets and our cities is now killing us. Because we designed all this space that we have, we've designed to accommodate these 2-ton objects, and we park them and we drive them. And, you know, when you look, it's like watching it's like analyzing a football game. You know, if you watch a 3-hour football game, there's like, you know, 20 minutes of actual stuff that happens in 3 hours, and the rest of it you're just sitting around waiting for the next thing to happen. The use of space in this country for cars is kind of the same thing. They sit there most of the time, and then you get in them and you go a little bit, and then you park them and they sit, and then you get in them and you go a little bit. And the roads are designed not to accommodate people, but to accommodate cars and to make cars move as fast as possible from here to here and here to here. There is a movement afoot amongst planners and designers of cities to kind of change that, and I know that's taken place here and elsewhere. It's another headline of a study, driver expectations, higher speeds resulting from less congestion. This was from 21. Major gaps in infrastructure, systemic criminalization of pedestrian and cyclist traffic on the road have contributed to alarming record increases in deaths of people struck and killed while walking and biking. Bicycling Magazine has its view, the actual reasons more cyclists are dying. One, cars and trucks are bigger than they used to be. So when you get hit by one, it's more likely to kill you. Oops. Smartphone use is on the rise, well, we know that. People drive more than ever, and there's, you know, it's interesting, we have so many more cars today than we did 20 years ago, but how many more square feet of road do we have? Not that much. I'm still driving on the same roads in Anderson Township that I've been driving on for the 20-some years that I've lived over there. So, but we've got a lot more cars using the same space and a lot more cyclists. And there are more cyclists on the road, according to statistic. So we're taking over more space. And then the Vision Zero, which is a program that advocates had urged cities to adopt to create plans when they build new things to incorporate Vision Zero, which means the idea being we want zero fatalities. We want to design streets and cutoffs and alleys and roads and all of this structure around those in a way that accommodates pedestrians and accommodates cyclists and cars, but not in a way that is just car-centric, so that the only design goal is to get a car through quickly. And so Vision Zero has stalled. So if you've seen me talk before, you've heard this story. But in New York City on Memorial Day, there was a car race, and Cosmopolitan magazine decided it would be a great idea if we had these cars racing through the streets of New York. And Henry Wells was one of the drivers. There's only like 6 cars in the race, but they were racing through the streets, and Henry loses control. He hits Evelyn Thomas's vehicle. Evelyn breaks her leg. The police come by. Henry's arrested, and he's held overnight in jail. You know, it's just another Tuesday in New York. But as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story is that this occurred on Memorial Day in 1896. This was the first recorded auto crash in U.S. history, and Evelyn's vehicle was a Columbia bicycle. And that was the Rolls Royce of bikes at the time. I mean, that was a $100 bike, you know, when $100 was 3 months worth of wages. So she was a high-end rider. in that 1896 time frame. And, it kind of emphasizes a few points. Number one, streets could be dangerous because people driving cars could lose control, but also women were a strong early adopter of this technology, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But in 1896, the cool technologies of the day were bicycles that had now gone from penny farthings teetering along 6 feet up off the ground, which was mostly male-dominated events, to the safety bike, which could go easier. You didn't have to be 6 feet off the ground. It was much more stable, easier to ride, and women thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. I think I'll try that now that you guys have gotten rid of the penny farthings. And so women adopted these safety bikes in huge numbers back in the late 1800s. That last decade was the real first bike boom. In the New York Times, if you search the archives, and I've done that, you can read almost every day a bike story in the social pages of the New York Times, because it was a cultural phenomenon, the bicycle. It was involved in music, it was involved in politics, it was involved in the social life and the parks, and the things that happened every day were reported in the Times as big news. And Henry Wells's crash was also reported in there after it happened. So another thing that happened in 1895 is that this book came out. It's called Road Rights and Liabilities of Wheelmen, written by George Burr Clemenson, and he was actually a relative of Aaron Burr, and he was a lawyer who rode bicycles in Wisconsin. And by 1895, so much litigation had come up involving bicycles that he could gather the cases from around the country, put them in a book, and come up with the first bike law book in that era. And I don't know if you guys probably know Brooks Gear, right? They're another company that came up around that era. I bought this from Brooks. I pictured this as the sort of bag that if I had purchased this book in 1895, I might stick it in there, because this is a original copy of the book that Clemenson wrote. And then this one is a copy of it's called the Handbook of the League of American Wheelmen, Ohio Division. And this was published in 1892. Both these are original copies here. So I thought, Brooks must have designed this bag for these books, basically. You're going to ride around, and this, the Ohio Handbook is really cool. It has, every county has a page, and there's a map, hand-drawn map in there, and then there's some paragraphs about the counties, what things you should do on your bike, what roads to avoid, where the dogs are, where the restaurants are, where the hotels are, and it's super. Some of them are pretty blunt. I mean, there's one that says there is nothing of interest in, I don't remember what county, but there's nothing of interest here. It's like a three sentence description, but I just picture this back in that first bike boom, somebody in the 1890s, and that's a well-worn copy. Just riding around, check the map, and you're heading downtown, or you're heading out to Butler County, where a lot of bicycling was happening back in that era as well. So yeah, this was George Burr Clemenson, and I love this quote, "To the devotees of terrestrial flight in its most exhilarating form." I mean, that's a great way to describe climbing on a bike and going, a terrestrial flight. So the early bike law cases involved the same issues that we fight over today, a lot of them. Are you allowed to ride on this road? Where on this road are you allowed to ride? What is the liability of someone if they run into you or you run into them, or they cut you off, or they claim you swerved, or the municipality left this bump in the road that shouldn't be there, or whatever? Those are the issues that were litigated in the late 1800s that Clemenson put into the book. And the book is organized in a way that if I were writing a book today, I'd do kind of the same thing. There's a table of cases. There's chapters on personal liability, municipal liability, city ordinances, and how those impact life on the bike and budding landowners and all these kinds of issues for liability and damages in the late 1800s. But now it wasn't all, peaches and creams. There were a lot of, let's just say, scofflaw cyclists back in the day. And again, if you pull up articles from the New York Times in the late 1800s, there's almost every day reckless bike riders, the killing of a little child by a reckless rider. There's these stories came out too often. And I don't know if I have the slide. Yes, I do a little bit here. There were the big cities and small put the police departments together in order to try to catch the scofflaw riders. When you hear the word scorcher, that was a kind of a derogatory term that applied to the rider who would ride willy-nilly through town and just kind of not be cognizant that maybe he's being a danger to himself. And I use the word he intentionally because it was, when you read through these, it's almost 95% or to 99% are men on bikes going too fast and scaring the horses, basically. So, but the Plainfield Lady Cyclists, and there was women's cycling groups all over the state of Ohio and all over the country. In the Ohio Handbook, in the front of it, there is a listing of all the clubs and who the people were that were involved in the clubs. And we had a number of ladies' clubs and men's clubs as well throughout the state in that late 1800s time frame. This appeared in the Sunday Boston Globe, August of 1895. It's a little game you could play with the bike rider. The bikes kind of had to share the road with the horses back in that era. And it was just fun. I mean, and so why was cycling so popular? And there's one word for it, and that's it, man. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. You get on the bike and you go, and it's just a blast. That's my grandson who learned how to ride. I helped teach him how to ride. Now he's zipping around with his buddies. That's me on the trail. That's Frank Henson, who you may know, or not. I don't know. Does this people know Frank still? He was the kind of the guru of Cincinnati cycling. He's now in Ecuador. He and his wife retired, and they are taking a non-car trip down to the bottom of South America and around and back. So they're taking buses, bikes, horses, boats, but they're not getting in a car, renting a car, and traveling at all. And they got stuck in Ecuador for the COVID year and a half, so now they're on the move again. But if you're young and retired as they are, you can do that. So what's happened about this? And what, in the early 1900s, the car came around and stuff happened. This was from Punch magazine in 1906, and if you can read the caption, the cyclist says, "Why can't you look where you're going?" And the motorist says, "How the dickens could I when I didn't know?" And that sort of tells you a lot about driving a car today as much as it did in the early 1900s. People drive as though they don't know what they're doing sometimes. This was a future look in 1950 of how they thought roads were and houses and living was going to be with the layers of a layer on top for pedestrians, then all the rest of the motorized traffic they felt was going to be underneath the pedestrian ways. Well, that didn't last. What we got was this kind of stuff in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and on to the present day. Cars being driven poorly and being crashed into other cars and worse. In 1895, Teddy Roosevelt was the chief of police in New York City, and he created the Scorcher Squad. This was a squad of kind of the first bike cops who would track down errant cyclists, and when cars came around, they could outrun the cars on these bikes in that time as well. So, jaywalking was another interesting concept. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of that, but it comes into play because it shows how the car industry wanted the roads. They wanted to take over the roads. They wanted people not walking on them, and they wanted people not riding on them. By the time of this jaywalking phenomenon, the bike boom had kind of bust. You know, the bike boom started around 1880, the first one, and into the early 1900s, and then by around 1920 or so, the bikes were gone, but people were still walking because not everybody could afford a car, and biking had sort of become passé because the cool new thing to do was to buy a car if you could do that. But what happened was, there's an article, The Secret History of Jaywalking, and it was a concerted effort by car makers and car sellers to kick you off the road. And so they created this phrase, jaywalking. A jay was sort of a rube, a bumpkin, somebody who didn't know what they were doing, or, you know, and if you were jaywalking, you were acting like an idiot, like a boob, like the clown, you know, like a clown or whatever. And so they wanted this derogatory term to be used and applied to people who chose to walk on the roads like we've done, you know, for the last several thousand years. And they were successful. You know, there were jaywalking ordinances and all of that. And the idea was to keep you on these little 6-foot spaces way over there and to leave this big wide open boulevard so the cars could go without running into you. But, you know, as we know, from the 60s, we had another bike boom, and that's where my Schwinn Continental kind of comes into the story. Schwinn kind of led the league in that back in the 60s and 70s, and all of a sudden we started seeing, you know, from 3 million plus to 8.5 million bikes being sold, and that started a boom for people in my age group. I guess I hit 65 this year, so back in the 70s, I was a kid buying my first bike. That Continental I bought, my dad was a bowler, and his buddy did bowling balls and bowling shirts and bowling trophies, and I learned how to silkscreen shirts, but I learned how to drill holes in marble for bowling trophies. And he gave me a penny a hole, and I'd bring out a crate, a 300-pound crate of marble, you'd knock it open, put it in the jig, and every hole was a penny. And 11,000 holes later, I bought that Schwinn for 110 bucks, and I moved up from the varsity. You know, it was 100. It cost me another 500 holes or so, but I wanted to get the Continental and not the varsity. So, but I was definitely in that bike boom. And since that time, bikes have well surpassed cars in terms of production. You know, and we think of sometimes you think of bikes as a luxury in the United States. Some people certainly use them as their everyday transportation, but you go to other parts of the world, more developed or less developed, and the bike is a big deal. I mean, it is in certain parts in the Norway and up in that area in Sweden and all of that, that is they have a 20-30% share of commuting and driving and trips. You go to places in Africa, and if you have a bike, you're the king. I mean, and there's an entire, it's called World Bike Relief. And if you look them up, if you have a few extra pennies you want to send, World Bike Relief helps get bikes to women in Africa to help up their ante in their communities and help them improve their lives as well. So there's a lot to be gained by the bicycle, even though we sometimes tend to think of it as sort of a less than day-to-day transportation. Biking to work has increased 60%. Hey, us old guys and women are riding bikes more often. It's skyrocketing among the old. This was an article from 2014. And now you think what's happened since 2014, and you know, all of a sudden, the e-bike has come along. How about that? And now the e-bike market is blasting past, even in terms of percentage of increased growth and sales. You know, the e-bikes are the hottest thing in the world right now in the bike industry. Here's a list of reasons, and as I put this in there because I think this hits all of mine. Can try to replace car trips. You buy a bike because of the hills. You ride with less effort. You increase your fitness while you're still riding around, but you get a little boost. A medical condition. I've got one bad knee and one knee that was good that I managed to make bad a year or so ago. And I'm hoping to be able to keep up with my young buddy Chris someday, but he's thin and younger and fast, but we'll see. But I'm looking for a class 3 bike, which will kick me up to 28 miles an hour. So this is the development of the bike and the e-bikes. What the market is right now is almost $1 billion, and where they're seeing it going up in the future. between the pedal assisted and the throttle assisted. Does anyone have e-bikes here? Do you have class 1, class 2?
The Bike Friday.
Yeah, is that a class 2? Oh, it is a 2.
Custom.
Oh, okay. Oh, you put your own motor on it?
I did.
Oh, that's cool. You have to be careful with that now, but we'll talk about that in a minute. E-bikes and e-vehicles in general are, again, the biggest thing going in the market these days. So let's talk a little bit about, and I'm going to get back to e-bikes in a minute, but what is the basic rules of the road? Does everybody here ride for the most part? Yeah, mostly? You ride on the road or trails? Roads, right? All right. So if you heard this mantra before, same roads, same rights, same rules. That's the basic bike law premise in Ohio. There's some special rules that we'll talk about, but the main mantra that I like to sing to the police officer is same road, same rights, same rules. I'm allowed to be here. I'm allowed to be where I am in the lane, and I'm following the same rules as everybody else. 451152 is a part of the Ohio Revised Code, which says these code sections, which are basically the rules of the road, are contained in those code sections, are applicable to bicycles whenever a bicycle is operated upon any highway or upon any path set aside for the exclusive use of bicycles. I've never seen one of these. A path set aside for the exclusive use of bicycles. We don't have that much in Ohio. And this word highway is an important one, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, when you ride on the road, you have to follow the rules of the road. I mean, that's what that provision says. So where is it that you're allowed to ride, and what's the most important bike law? And it's the AFRAP law. Now, if you have listened to me talk or you're familiar with advocacy, you know that AFRAP stands for as far right as practicable. And in Ohio, the AFRAP or far right law is found in 451155, the A section. Every person operating a bicycle upon a roadway shall ride as near to the right side of the roadway as practicable, obeying all traffic rules applicable to vehicles, exercising due care, blah, blah, blah. But that far right language, or as near to the right side, I like that better than some of the statutes that say as far right as possible. It doesn't say possible. Police officers think it says possible. Motorists think it says possible. Judges sometimes think it says possible, but it doesn't say that. It uses the word as near to the right side of the roadway as practicable. And that word, if you're ever issued a ticket, that's the key word in the whole game right there, because practicable is not defined anywhere in the code. And before we wrote the C section about 10 years ago, I spent 25 years arguing that practicable means reasonable and safe. So you don't have to ride as far right as possible, because that would not be reasonable or safe. You're going to be running over debris, you're going to be up against a curve, you're going to be running over sewer grates, and all of those things. You're going to be running into cars that might happen to be parked there. That's not a reasonable and that's not a safe place for you to be. It may be as far right as possible, but that's not what the law says. The law says practicable. My argument to judges was the legislature would not mandate that you do something in a vehicle on the roadway that is unsafe and unreasonable, whether it's a car, a bike, a bus, a Humvee, a motorcycle, whatever it is. The legislature is not going to mandate by law that you do something that is unsafe or unreasonable. So before the C section, we used to argue these AFRAP tickets, as we called them, by suggesting and making arguments that whatever the lane position that the cyclist was in when he got the ticket was a safe and reasonable place to be. Sometimes we won, sometimes we didn't. But we did end up rewriting the AFRAP law back in 2006, and we added the little secret weapon at the bottom of it, and we incorporated some of this language. This section does not require a person operating a bike to ride at the edge of the roadway when it is unreasonable or unsafe to do so. Then it says conditions. We give a few examples. When necessary to avoid fixed or moving objects, parked or moving vehicles, surface hazards, or if it is otherwise unsafe or impracticable to do so. And then this last sentence is the last part of the sentence, including if the lane is too narrow for the bicycle and an overtaking vehicle to travel safely side by side within the lane. There were two of us on the OBF board at the time who were lawyers who had done some of this litigation. And we didn't know, we made this language up, and we didn't know if it was going to fly. Nobody else has this language in the country that I'm aware of. But we thought, you know, if you're in a reasonable spot and a car can't pass you at a reasonable distance without leaving the lane, you know, that lane's too narrow for you to be forced to ride too far to the right. So you can take the lane, you can take the entire lane. What this is saying is the AFRAP law does not apply if the lane's too narrow. So, you know, what is a too narrow lane, and where can you ride? First, you're supposed to ride as near to the right as practicable, but you're also, the law says you're not to ride more than two abreast in a single lane. Let me go back to that. The B section of 451155, persons on bikes and motorcycles shall ride not more than two abreast in a single lane. So we used to use that before the C section was around as well to argue, well, gee, if one person can ride to the right, two people should be able to take the whole lane. They should each get half a lane at least. And that helped us in some of these traffic cases. But before the C section, that was the rule. Let me go, I've already kind of chatted about that. So what's too narrow? Well, Carrie Caffrey is a cyclist in Florida, and she's also a very nice graphic artist. And she created this image. This shows a 14-foot lane here. This shows the truck with its mirror at the edge of the lane. The truck's 102 inches wide to here. And then she's got the cyclist, and she says, all right, let's give the cyclist 30 or 40 inches of space from the right. Can that vehicle safely pass that cyclist in a 14-foot lane? Well, here's where the cyclist ends. Here's a minimum 3-foot clearance, and the truck can't do it. It doesn't fit. And so the argument there, and which is adopted in Florida, that a 14-foot lane is too narrow to be shared. I use that same argument in Ohio. If you're on a lane that's 14 foot, you have the right to take the entire lane. If it's 15 foot, we have a little bit of an argument. There aren't too many 15-foot wide lanes. Most of the lanes on most of the roads that most people ride on most of the time are 10 foot, 11 foot, maybe 12 foot. 14 is pretty rare unless you're in a wide open boulevard in a big city. You might get a 14-foot lane. Most lanes are a lot less than that. We're going to try a case in Ironton where a cyclist was making a left turn. A commercial driver in a van went to pass the cyclist in the intersection, and they were arguing the cyclist was supposed to be over here. Well, she was making her turn, clipped the van, and boy, they fought us tooth and nail until the courthouse steps on this. And we went out to measure it. It was like 9.5-foot lane. And it's like, I can almost touch it. I'm not quite 9.5. I can go 6 foot anyway. And it was one of the narrowest lanes I'd had a case in a long time. And this Armstrong Cable down in southeast Ohio, man, they fought us. They had big firm lawyers fighting us tooth and nail right up to the verge of trial. And then they ended up bumping their offer from a few thousand to many thousand, and we ended up settling the case. But we thought we were going to try that case and see how these arguments really worked. So the most important law, 451155, you're supposed to ride to the right, but as a practical matter, in virtually every lane in Ohio, you're going to be able to take whatever position you want in the lane that you feel safe in. Something you have to watch, and that's somewhat unique to Ohio. Ohio is what's called a home rule state. There aren't too many of those in the country. It's written into the Ohio Constitution. What that means is cities have power to create their own laws, and they can be different from state laws on some things, but they have to be consistent with state laws on other things. And it's not any clearer than that in the Constitution. I mean, it's actually, that's clearer than what the Constitution says. So there's been a lot of litigation. City of Cleveland passed a tow truck ordinance, and the state claimed that its tow truck ordinance trumped the city's ordinance, and they went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court said, no, the city ordinance wins. Another county passed an ordinance on drilling, fracking, and the state and the people that wanted to do the fracking argued that that city law was inapplicable because of home rule, and the Supreme Court heard that case, and they said, okay, the state wins that one. We have to have consistent fracking laws through all the counties, but we can have different tow truck laws. How would they handle a case that involves a bike? That's interesting, because there is one. In Hamilton County, there's 48 different jurisdictions, 48 different lawmaking bodies in Hamilton County. And in Cuyahoga County, there's almost 80. So each one of those city councils can pass their own set of laws, and they do. And we'll take a look at them here in a minute. But 451107 is the statute that says cities can pass their own laws, and with regard to traffic, the rules of the road do not prevent local authorities from carrying out the following activities, and it says regulating the operation of bicycles. So the state law says cities can regulate the operation of bicycles, provided that no such regulation shall be fundamentally inconsistent with the uniform rules of the road. We wrote that, again, nobody else had that language in a law. We wrote that in 2006, and it got passed. The other thing we added to that was, and no such regulation shall prohibit the use of bicycles on any public street. What we found was, we did a survey of, I think it was the Cleveland area, and we graded them from A to F in terms of how consistent the laws were with the state laws. And almost all of a particular swath of cities, like 30 or 40 or 50 cities, got an F. And we were trying to figure out, why that was, but they would have bike bans, and they would have mandatory single file rules, and you couldn't ride on your bike on the road during the rush hour and all of this. And so we passed this, we got this passed in 2006 thinking that would solve it, and of course it didn't. Because what we found, and if you want to Google something, you can Google safe riding regulations for bicycles in Ohio. That phrase was created by somebody in the back room of a publishing house, and the publishing house published a real big book of laws and ordinances, and they would sell them to cities, and they would go to the city and they would say, look, you don't have to create your own city ordinances. We got this whole book here. You can pick and choose the ones you want to pass, fill in the blanks, and then you get your own set of laws without having to reinvent the wheel. And apparently the guy was a good salesman in Northern Ohio, because he sold them to this entire swath of communities that had the F grade for the bicycle, and they came up with these safe riding regulations for bicycles. And I call them the stupid laws. And I wrote a bit about them called Your Ticket to the Stupid Laws on the blog. So what do they say? They have mandatory side path law. If there's a side path, you have to use it. Mandatory sidewalk law. If there's a sidewalk next to the road, you have to use it. Mandatory bell, mandatory audible signal if you pass someone. Nobody else has that in a car. You must walk your bike through intersections. I've never figured out what that means. On a sidewalk, you must dismount and walk past a blind person. Well, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, but every community had this same language in all of their things, and apparently they all bought the same book. They all just voted on it, yay, passed it, and it became law, and it's just ridiculous. And now, once they're in 40 different cities, you have to go each one, and somebody gets a ticket, and then you fight that ticket, and the judge agrees with the city. Then you go to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals says, well, no, you can't do that. That's against the state law. It became a mess, so we thought by passing in 2006 this idea that you had to be fundamentally consistent with state law would get rid of this. But no, they're still on the books. They're still on the books now, and some of them. In 4511-711, driving on the sidewalk says, no person shall drive any vehicle other than a bike upon a sidewalk. blah, blah, blah. Nothing in this section shall be construed as prohibiting local authorities from regulating the operation of bicycles, except no local authority may require that bikes be operated on the sidewalks. We added 2 different code provisions that said you can't ban bikes from the road and you can't shove bikes onto the sidewalk. But, you know, that didn't work, at least immediately. There's a case out of Dayton, Kane versus the city of Dayton. Mr. Kane was riding his bike. It was 30 minutes after sunset. So if you know your traffic law, you know that sunset is the magic time when you have to have your lights on in Ohio. Well, Dayton passed an ordinance that was kind of beneficial to bike riders. It said, yes, you have to have your lights on 30 minutes or at sunset if you're driving a car, but if you're on a bike, you could wait till an hour after sunset. So now you've got these 2 different rules. Cars, lights on at sunset, bikes, lights on an hour after. Mr. Kane gets run over by a fire truck 30 minutes after sunset, no light on. And he sues the city of Dayton because they ran him over. And the city of Dayton said, you know, that law we passed, that was stupid. We shouldn't have done that. It doesn't apply. Home rule doesn't apply. Traffic law for the state has to control this situation, not our silly ordinance. And the court agreed. The court, and I think the court got it right because the court analyzed it as a home rule question. And I won't bore you with the 48-step process, but they went through the process and they said, you know, traffic laws are so important, you can't have them changing every time you can't have a big change in the traffic law every time some little boundary line for the city changes. They have to be consistent. Something like this has to be consistent. You can't be flipping your lights on for this village and off for that one or whatever. So the court decided that law was one that had to be uniform and the state law controlled. The bike rider lost that case. He ended up getting a good settlement anyway for a bunch of reasons, but that's a helpful case 99% of the time, because 99% of the time the rules that are written by cities are not beneficial to you. I mean, they're designed to kick you off the road, to limit when you can ride, to say, well, okay, you can ride here, but you have to ride single file, and you can't ride between 4 and 6 in the afternoon because that's rush hour, and you're going to slow all the cars down. They're not allowed to do that. And we're still fighting those cases up in Cleveland area, especially because there's some places up there that take that very seriously. So 451107 is that code section. There's still bans on the books. And here's the real world application of that in Pickerington, Ohio. My client already had a crash where an idiot slammed into him, caused a very severe brain injury, in the hospital, in the rehab, couldn't walk, learned how to walk, learned how to ride, got back on his bike, and is riding in Pickerington, in broad daylight, doing what he's supposed to do, off to the right, and he gets hit by a 90-year-old guy who couldn't see very well, and the police officer came to the scene and said, you know what, this is the bike rider's fault, because in Pickerington, our city ordinance says bikes are required to be ridden on a sidewalk because they have the stupid laws. And so they wrote up the crash report saying this was the cyclist's fault. He was in violation of the ordinance. And when he came to me, he was like, good grief, this is a bad spot for someone with a claim because he got rear-ended. It's clearly not his fault. We could have done a couple of things. I could have challenged the ordinance in court. We could have tried to go up to the Supreme Court, get a big ruling. But the Pickerington city attorney was a person I had some familiarity with through other cases, and I knew him to be relatively reasonable, so I called him up and I said, look, here's the deal. Either we're going to be in court for the next 5 years and you guys are going to spend several $100,000 on legal fees, or you can just say that you can change the police report to say we recognize that state law trumps our city ordinance, and which is what they ended up doing. So they ended up issuing a revised report, and we got it done in 20 minutes rather than 5 years of litigation. But it could have been could have been very bad. The most recent bike law that took effect in 2018 is the e-bike law, which is what I was asking about before. In Ohio, we have 3 classes of e-bikes. Class 1 is a 20-mile-an-hour max speed but only while you're pedaling. Class 2, 20-mile-an-hour max speed, but it'll push you along when you're not pedaling. And the Class 3 bikes go up to 28 miles an hour, and they have to be pedaled in order to get there. The general rule is for Class 1 and 2, you can generally ride on trails. Class 3, you generally cannot ride on trails. A trail has the right under the law to opt out by saying we're not going to allow e-bikes on our trail. I'm not familiar with any around that have done that. Most of them say, and nobody wants to police that as a trail authority. They don't want to look around and see if you've got your motor on, if you're, whatever, as long as you're riding reasonably. And 20 miles an hour, I've been passed by people riding fat tire, 75-pound bikes going 20 miles an hour. And they pass my wife and I in the trail and say, hey, more power to them, I'm okay with that. But that's now you have your homemade e-bike, and if they're not within the categories here, the risk you run is that they can be deemed a vehicle that's not allowed on the road or something along those lines. So if you have a crash or something like that, if that is a factor in the crash, that can be something that they'll write up. In Warren County, last year, there was a fellow who was killed. He's out in the country riding to his house, to his left, 2-lane road, and it's debatable whether he signaled or not. There's some that say he did and some said he didn't, but he started to make a left turn, double yellow line, a car tried to pass him and hit him, but he had a Huffy or something with a gas motor mounted onto it like a lawnmower engine. It looked like it was a pretty good sized motor, but he was hit while he was turning and ended up being killed, and that became a big factor in their analysis of how fast was he going and why was he going that fast and how did he was this a legal vehicle to even be on the road with. And so since it only happened in the last 6 months, they're going to probably be litigating that for a while. Some other bike law issues, potholes. There was a case out of Columbus, Crabtree versus Columbus. Mr. Crabtree was riding his bike, and the rules for potholes are the same as for bikes are the same as for cars. If the city is made aware of a problem and they don't do anything about it, and you end up running through a pothole and damaging your car, you can have a claim against the city. In this case, the area where Mr. Crabtree was hit was an area that was prone to flooding, and when the rains came and it did flood, it would wash all this debris and sticks and all this crowd onto the road, and there were potholes. And he was trying to dodge through this when a car hit him, and he suffered very severe injuries, a quadriplegic injury. So it was major injury damage kind of case. And a friend of mine handled this out of Columbus, and he sued the guy that hit him, who didn't have a lot of insurance, but he also sued the city, saying, hey, you knew about this. This makes a very dangerous condition for cyclists. Maybe a Humvee can run through this and not have a problem, but for a cyclist, you're asking them to dodge through a minefield of potential problems. And the court case got tossed out by the trial judge, but it was reversed on appeal. And rather than take the case through the trial, the Columbus City paid him $1.3 million to settle the case. And yeah, Mr. Crabtree, he needed every bit of that for his future. So those are the most important of the bike laws. There's a few unique bike laws, one of which I call the Marty McFly rule. You're not allowed to hook your bike, to a car and get dragged along by a car. But most of the rest of the law relative to riding a bike is the same law that you would have driving your car. The key points are where in the lane are you allowed to be, and again, what are the rules that the city might pass in order to try to keep you from being there or change how you ride your bike. Any questions up to this point? So I think I did 8 and 7 and 6. So let's do 5. Who's got number 5 and 4? Oh, here we go. All right. Who's got number 5?
Well, I got 4.
You have 4. All right. Well, you have the low numbers. You get to pick between a cartoon, and this is called the Bicycle Experiment. It's about the Buffalo Soldiers in Missoula, Montana, who in 1896, took like a 1,700-mile bike trip to test for the military how bikes would do under those kind of conditions. So either one. This is funny, this is more serious and historical. So,
I think I'm going to take this one.
all right.
Thank you, sir.
So you get to win the cartoon book. Now, if you guys want to trade, that's fine. Yeah, you can work that out. You can do your own deals. So what about when you crash, or if you crash? How do crashes happen? You know, there's 4 or 5 ways that motorists screw up. Sometimes they right hook you. Sometimes they left cross you. Those are the 2 big ones that I see. Sometimes you get pinched off where you're going straight, the motorist may be going straight, but they kind of slide by and sideswipe you. And sometimes they just hit you from behind. I handled a case up in Cleveland. It was of some renown, I guess. It was this is an F-350 dual-wheel truck, made a left turn. The road runs due east-west. It was at sunset. The truck driver came to this little intersection, was going to make a left turn, sat there for a minute, testified later he couldn't see a thing, and decided to go. And there's 5 cyclists coming at him who he says he didn't see. When he made his turn, the first 2 were in front of him, and he hit them. And I had the lead rider, I had his family. He was killed on the scene, Matt Billings. And the second rider was also hit, and he lived for a week and then passed away. And then the next 3 riders hit the side of the truck and had varying degrees of injury as well. They survived, though. And this left-turning motorist walked away from the criminal trial with a not guilty verdict. And I can do an hour talking about that case, but I won't. But it's the jury. Well, the prosecutor, in my view, was playing not to lose instead of playing to win, and was kind of too easy and wasn't as aggressive as I thought he should have been. I ended up going to Cleveland for a week to watch the criminal trials. I wanted to see kind of what it was going to be like when we had the civil case. And we had 5 lawyers, 4 Cleveland hotshots and me, and we teamed up for representing the 5, and then we went after the fellow who drove. He owned a landscaping company, so he had good insurance, but he didn't have enough insurance to pay my claim, let alone the 5 that he caused. So we ended up resolving the case eventually, but we made him dig 6 figures out of his own retirement funds to add to his insurance in order to get it done. So these can be very hazardous, very deadly crashes. Dooring is another common scenario. This was a fatal dooring crash where the cyclist was in the bike lane, which was painted next to the cars parked, of course. So when you open your car door, now the bike lane becomes the deadly door zone, and it knocked the rider into the next lane, and he was hit by a car and killed. There's also bad cycling behavior that can lead to crashes as well. The most common one, sliding up, where you're maybe very legal to do, but you're sliding up next to cars that are stopped at a red light, and if you don't realize that lead car or the second car is making a right turn, they may not appreciate the fact that you're there because they're looking this way and they don't see you coming, and they make the right turn and you end up getting hooked, particularly if there is a semi in that position. Salmon riding the wrong way, I still get people to this day telling me that's how I was taught to ride. You're going to ride against traffic so I can jump out of the way. Well, no, that's not how you're supposed to ride a bike. You're supposed to ride with traffic. Failure to see, S-E-E, that's a term from motorcycle training. It means survey, evaluate, execute. Look ahead, evaluate what's going on, and execute a plan early enough in the game so that if there's something up there, you're out away from it early enough so you're not making last-minute moves on a bike or a motorcycle. It's usually P to the 4th, but I'm just going to say poor prior planning, and where you're darting in and out of parked cars or something along those lines, and then again riding in the door zone. Those are 5 things cyclists do, some of which may be legal, some not, but as a matter of good traffic practice, you should try to avoid doing these types of things. So what should you do if you are involved in a crash? Well, keep the bike in the helmet. I put that up there first. Obviously, if you're in a crash, get the police there, get the EMTs there. People forget they want to get their bike fixed and they want to get their helmet, and they send the helmet off to the company and they get the bike fixed, and then they call me and I say, well, where's the helmet? Oh, I sent that away. And where's your bike? Well, I got it fixed. And if we don't have the evidence, and we lose a lot of the case if we don't have the proof of what happened. And the bike is often can provide evidence of force and speed and all of this. And it just gives us a nice thing to be able to walk this bike up to a jury that's got the rear wheel mangled and the front fork is shaved off. And you know, I prefer people that just keep those things. Make sure the police report is prepared, which means make sure you call the police, get them to the scene, even if the other driver or the car driver is saying, yeah, we don't have to call the cops on this one, let's just work it out, or you're not hurt very badly, are you, or whatever, to try to get you to move and not have the police called. Make sure the police are called, because even though they're very apologetic at the scene, as soon as everybody drives away, it's going to become your fault, I can guarantee it. You would think people would know that, but I can tell you, when you are hit by a car or have something happen to you on the road, your brain can easily become scrambled. I had a client who I've known for many years. She was the head of a bicycle advocacy organization, one of the bigger organizations in the state. She's driving to a meeting on her bike. She's dressed up, got her backpack in a bike lane in Columbus. It's raining. And this young lady is late for class, and she makes a right turn into a parking lot, takes out my client, hits the ground. She gets up. She's clearly kind of rattled. And she calls me from the scene of the crash and tells me what happened. And she said she called the police, but she didn't know if she should ask them to send an ambulance. And so I went through my, my concussion protocol questions, and I said, look, get somebody there, and and don't take no for an answer. And they were like mad at her because she was on 911. They have this whole call where they're kind of treating her poorly because she's not like, she doesn't have an arm dangling off and her legs are fine, but she had a head injury. She had and that head injury was something that was documented immediately in the ER and then continued to bug her. It wasn't like a traumatic, she's in a coma head injury, but she was a person who, very high functioning, top of her level of professionalism as an executive. And one of the great things about that case was she did Sudoku. I don't do Sudoku, but I guess there are levels of Sudoku, and she was a level 8, and she couldn't do a level 1 after this crash, and we were able to kind of prove her head injury and recovery by Sudoku level. So, 3 months she could do a 3, and then 6 months maybe she was at a 4, and then by the time it took her a year and a half before her brain injury cleared up to the point where she was behaving and thinking quickly, making smart moves, not becoming emotional, not having issues with bright lights and sounds and all these little subtle changes that a head injury can cause. So make sure the EMTs come, get the motorist's information. If you can, get photos, take lots of photos. You can't have too many photos of the scene, your bike, your injuries. Get someone to make a map, get the names and phone numbers of people that are there. Keep track of your bike damage. Get the EMTs to the scene. Get treatment. Don't just ride off. I had a case where a fellow had a puppy who was riding in the country, and his puppy came running out to play with him and hits the bike, and he goes down, and when his arm's kind of dangling, and the owner comes out, and they joke about it, and then he rides off, and he realizes something's wrong, and he literally took his bike, rode through the doors of the dock in the box out in the country, and they ended up with a clavicle fracture, surgery, plate and screws, the whole bit. But adrenaline is like magic fairy dust. I mean, you hit the ground and you hop up and you think, oh, I'm not too bad, I'm okay, I can, and you go off on your way and you don't realize how injured you can be. Follow the EMT's advice. If they tell you to go to the hospital, don't be one of those people that has in your crash report refused medical advice, left against medical advice, because that's what we do as cyclists. We tend to pick ourselves up, sometimes you're embarrassed you're even there. All this attention is on you and you just want to get the heck out of there, when in fact, you got to listen to the EMTs. Head injuries are common. When you bang your head, even with a helmet, head injuries are very common. They're not catastrophic TBI head injuries, but they can still rattle you for a long time. Follow up with your own doctor after you go to the emergency room. Do what the doctors tell you to do if they follow medical advice. And then, call your favorite bike lawyer, and then, it's a little pitch, but you have to assess, what kind of claim you have. Is this a minor thing? Did you get hurt? You got some scratches, you got better, and a week later, you're 100%. That's a different scenario than if you've got something broken, something scarred, some surgery. Anything along those lines is going to be more complicated. So whether it's me or somebody, get some legal advice before, because what'll happen is the insurance company might call you, and then they'll say on day 3, oh, gee, we'll give you, $1,500 or $2,500, and we'll call this a day. And if you do that, and then your toe falls off 6 months later, you're screwed, because once you take the money and sign the release, the case is over, and there's nothing we can do to get it back. So in Ohio, there is a 2-year statute of limitations for most traffic crash cases. And if you have a dog involved, it actually goes out a couple years beyond that. So we have lots of time, don't have to do things quickly in these cases. And so what we do, we get the bike and the helmet, hopefully, if you guys haven't thrown them away. We want to make sure a police report is actually prepared, and then often, if the cyclist is hauled away, the police report is based on what the motorist says, and that may not be accurate. So we have to get that police report, see if that is what really happened, and then sometimes we have to prepare an affidavit and we supplement the crash report because the officer has taken as gospel what the motorist says and has ignored what really happened in the case. This is more true with bicycle crashes than any other, except maybe pedestrian, because if a Humvee hits a Beetle, there's a lot of stuff going on at the scene the officer can look at. When a bicyclist is hit by a car, usually the bike is moved, the car is moved, and there isn't the sort of crash debris field that somebody can walk up to and go, okay, I can see this guy was here and this guy was here. They can figure it out on their own. They need someone to tell them what happened, and most officers get a few bike cases from time to time, but they're not bike crash reconstruction experts. I've done 500 cases at this point, and I feel like I can look at a crash report and kind of look at a bike crash scene and kind of figure out what happened. So we take lots of photos. We get the map done. I have a buddy with the drone. We can fly a drone through the place and take it from the car driver's view and the bike rider's view. We handle the property damage because that's a tough one. If you're on a bicycle, it's not like a car where you want to get your property damage taken care of. The other person has some insurance, and that person's insurance says, well, your bike is 4 years old, and you only paid $3,500 for it, and it depreciates 20% each year, so we'll give you $1,000 or whatever. You're going, no, wait a minute, I upgraded the group, and I've got these nice wheels on it, and whatever. And you have to really fight sometimes to get a fair value on a bike that's not brand new 10 minutes out of the showroom when it gets damaged or destroyed. We also find that if you have good homeowners insurance, that can come into play here, because let's say you've got a $12,000 Cervelo that is now broken in half, and it's a couple of years old, but it's still worth a lot of money, and the car driver, their duty is not to buy you a new Cervelo. Their duty is to pay you the reasonable value of your bike, and they're going to look at depreciation and how it lost value over time and blah, 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 and they're going to write you a check for less than you might like. Your homeowners, depending on what your deductible is, you might have a replacement cost, so their obligation is to replace it with another Cervelo, and frequently we can get more money out of the homeowners on a property damage claim than we can out of the car driver. And the homeowners, your company it's not like they're going to get screwed. They're going to go over to the car driver's insurance, and they have what's called intercompany arbitration, where they work these things out independently without your knowledge. So you get a bigger check, your insurance doesn't go up, your insurance company gets reimbursed by the other guy's insurance, and they work it out between them. So there's a lot of stuff that's involved, even in the simple part of the case, which is the property damage that we know from experience that may not filter down to people that are just on the road getting hit. So I've got down here what insurance companies can apply. What we do is we get the driver's auto policy involved. We try to find out if the driver was working for somebody, and we get that employer policy involved. Your uninsured motorist policy in your auto, assuming you have a car and you have an auto policy, if you have uninsured motorist coverage, that may come into play depending on whether the other guy has coverage, how much coverage he has, how bad your injuries were, and how much coverage you have. So take an example. Let's say you have a case that's worth $100,000 for whatever reason. You've been injured to the point where we think it's a $100,000 case. Let's say the other driver has Ohio state minimum coverage of $75,000 or $25,000. So you're now taking $25,000 from the other driver, and you're $75,000 short of the value of your case. If you have coverage up to $100,000, we can go to your carrier and say, hey, we got 25 over here. You owe Mr. Client, the balance, and get that $100,000 from your own company. If you're on the road a lot, and it doesn't take, I think most people in here who ride on the road are probably on the road more than they're on the trails. I would suggest you get as much uninsured motorist coverage as you think you can afford, because that has become a big part of our practice, because there's so many people driving around with sort of state minimum coverage or no coverage. And they tend to be, they're not exactly on a hot streak, when they're doing whatever they're doing, that they either can't afford better coverage or they don't need better coverage. So they may not be the best drivers in the world as well, and you're more likely to be hit by somebody like that than somebody who's taking care of their Mercedes very carefully and keeping $1 million of liability coverage on it. So I would strongly recommend you get as much coverage as you can afford, and then talk to your agent about an umbrella policy that is very cheap, $100, $150 a year, that would cover over the top of your uninsured motorist as well as your homeowners. This umbrella policy only kicks in the catastrophic event where you're injured so badly that you've blown through all the available coverage. It's like a once-in-a-lifetime event. That's why it's so cheap. And you now have $1 million of money sitting off to the side that you're keeping over there. You're paying a small premium to keep that available in the event that you have, a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophic loss. But at least there's money there to pay your bills and pay your salary that you're not going to make anymore, and whatever that makes the claim more valuable. We have now, get the uninsured, get the umbrella, and then you have to make sure that the umbrella covers the uninsured motorist, because they'll tell you, your agent will tell you, this is $1 million of coverage over your auto policy. Well, that may not be entirely true. A few years ago, auto companies started breaking them apart. They will cover your liability. So if you run over an orthopedic surgeon, that guy's got $1 million claim against you, you have a liability coverage of $1 million under the umbrella. But it doesn't cover your uninsured motorist. It doesn't cover you unless you pay a separate premium. And they don't always tell you that because they don't think you want that. But if you ride a bike and you're going to spend the money for some good uninsured motorist coverage, make sure you're getting the umbrella that covers that. I have an article on my page called, "Does Your Umbrella Have a Hole in It?" And I wrote that a year or two ago because I had 3 cases where people had an umbrella, didn't cover their case. I had a guy who had carried an umbrella for 40 years, switched companies 2 months before he got run down by a car, and the company he switched to didn't cover, and he signed off on, you sign off on all the forms, blah, 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 you don't even read them. Well, the one form he didn't read said, this does not cover your uninsured motorist. We had 2 other cases, $1 million cases, limited because the umbrella did not cover. So you have to make sure if you get the umbrella, it covers the situation that you want it to cover. All right, so I've talked about a lot of this here. I'm going to get to, because I know we're at 8 o'clock and I don't want to go too late. So here we go. Where to find evidence? Well, one place is police records. It's one thing we look at. In this particular case, a young lady, 13 years old, was on Banning Road on the west side of Cincinnati. And this is kind of hard to read because this is my handwriting up here. They're coming from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. 3 kids are in a line, riding along the white line on that side, riding this way. Kid number 1 cuts across the road and then starts riding over here, going this way. Kid number 2 does that. Tammy is the youngest. She starts to do that. This fellow is coming up from behind, and this fellow swears, maybe not on a stack of Bibles, but he swears under oath in his deposition that he hit her right here, right in the middle of the road. He had already crossed the road, and she was here, and she kept coming, and there was no way for him to avoid her. And Tammy was killed. And we got this case, and the insurance company denied the claim. We start digging into it, and I see these points, A, B, and C, and I asked the police officer that investigated, what is that? He said, well, those are paint chips. And then he gave me, once the criminal case was dismissed, there wasn't any criminal case, he gave me the envelope and had these 3 little paint chips in it. And they had taken pictures of them, and these paint chips lined up right on the white line. And my expert, who's a bicycle accident reconstruction expert, testified that based on the paint chips and the way the bike was hit and damaged and the way the car was hit and some other things that were on the scene, this crash happened when the impact was back in the back wheel. She wasn't this way, which is what he said. She had cut in front of him and he hit her broadside. He hit this bike from the rear, spun it around, and she went sliding up into the windshield. And those 3 paint chips became the crux to the whole case because he said those 3 paint chips represented the point of impact. Because when a car hits something and stuff drops from it, the car is going and it tends to drop further along the path because it's got the momentum, but it drops down to where in line with where the impact was. So if he had hit her here, the paint chips would be here. They didn't all just float in a straight line, whoops, I'm sorry, in the wrong way. It didn't just float in a straight line to the white line. So we made that case go from no liability denied to a case where we could actually get some benefit for the family. So what if I told you security cameras are a good place to find evidence? In this case, the cyclist, this is out on the west side. This is Work Road and Glenmore. Glenmore, I think. The cyclist is coming here and he makes a left turn. And he swore to me. He said, I came around the corner and I have no idea where this car came from. I just got whacked by a car. It didn't make any sense to him. And we were trying to figure out what happened. And we were able to find this car dealer or car repair. And they had this camera up in the red box. It happened to be pointed down towards where the crash kind of happened. And here's what we found when we did that. Let's see if this will play for us. So here's the guy, the offending driver, and look where he's parked. He's parked the wrong way on the sidewalk. Oh, that corner place, that's a bar. It's kind of a popular hangout. And so his buddies came out, and here comes our guy. The buddies are going out on the road, and here comes our guy around the corner. It's like you can figure out why he couldn't figure out, and where in the heck did a car come from? It didn't make any sense to him. But we'd had no clue what happened because this guy lied about it, and I think he said he was pulling in, not pulling out, and the guy cut him off or ran the light or something. I don't know. It was a bizarre story, but we were able to get that handled from the security camera. In this case, this was up in Columbus. The cyclist, narrow 2-lane road, cyclist is on the right edge. The vehicle comes, and it is like a pickup dump, kind of small dump truck with a trailer, and the trailer's hauling landscaping debris, and they've got bushes and stuff hanging off the trailer, And as it goes by our guy, there's a car coming the opposite direction. The trailer doesn't move over. He ends up hitting our cyclist with the tree limb that's sticking out from the trailer, and he goes on his merry way, doesn't stop. And our guy ends up, 2 counties over, basically, and then by the time he's awake and aware, he doesn't know who hit him, what it looked like, or anything else. This was a bizarre case because the woman who was driving the vehicle coming towards the crash was a investigator for the BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. She was a forensic scientist at BCI. It's like, oh, we got the perfect witness. And I called her up and I'm talking to her and she says, I don't know. I don't know what it looked like. I remember being next to me. I saw the bike. I knew something was going to happen. She pulls over. She's helping our guy, but she couldn't say a word about what the thing looked like. So we start looking around, and further up the road, we find a business with some security cameras. And here's the image on the top that we got from the security camera. And then we were looking around different places, and we found Darby Creek Nursery, and there's a picture of their vehicle. So we sued Darby Creek, and they denied it, but at the end, they ended up paying. When I took the driver's deposition, he denied it was him. But, yes, he was driving a truck that day. Yes, he'd picked up landscaping debris that day. Yes, he had a big bunch of stuff in the back of the truck that day. Yes, he was on that road that day, but it wasn't him. So they ended up agreeing that maybe they should pay that. We got evidence from a Metro bus in Cincinnati. This was a very bad crash where the client came out of this street up here, and as he was going through the intersection, this car ran a red light and horrific injury. We couldn't, he didn't know what exactly had happened, but he remembered the bus being there. So I went down to Metro and we were able to, we don't have the video from this, but this is another potential source of evidence, which I hadn't really thought of before, but they have cameras on all the buses. And this guy was just sitting there picking up people and happened to have the camera pointed in the right direction. So we were able to get, in that case, some good evidence. Sometimes those cameras you wear, they come in handy. In this case, you can count how many seconds this guy was driving in a straight line up this hill. This is in Clifton in Cincinnati. But the motorist said, he came out of nowhere. And then I got a call from the insurance adjuster, and she said, we're going to deny this claim. Your guy was reckless, and he came out of nowhere. And I said, have you seen the video? And she went, there's video? And so, here's the video. He's in line to go up the hill. The light changes. And there he is, recklessly careening, and slowly up the hill. And here he goes into the intersection. And then all of a sudden, he gets rear-ended. And he goes down. And he looks back, and there's his bike under the car. And now another interesting thing from this, when we were talking about head injuries before, he's there, he sees the thing, he gets up, he goes over to that tree, and then this building here, if you're familiar with the hospital we call Pill Hill in Cincinnati, this is a Chipotle down here, and every doctor in the hospital comes across the street, and they're eating lunch at Chipotle, and my guy works at the EPA, and they all come running out. I mean, there's like 15 people in lab coats around him, and he wants to get up and go, and the camera's on and running, and he's telling him he's okay, I just got to get home, and they're telling him, sit down, sit down. 30 minutes goes by. Finally, the ambulance and all that gets there, and of course he has a head injury and a concussion, but I showed him this, and he has no memory to this day, no memory of any of that. I mean, and so he could have just gotten up and wandered off or gone home with no treatment because he didn't realize he was hurt in the moment. So, like I said, get a crash, get some help. Your GPS data can also come into play. This is the map. Let's see, which one is this? Oh, this is a map of a crash from a drunk driver. And he was mapping out his GPS route. The data on the top here is the one I want to look at, though, because we're getting down on time. Let me find, this thing. So this is the Garmin that was on the bike of the fellow who was killed in the crash when the truck came out and made a left turn, right? So he's riding with the Garmin. And this is the bird's eye view of the road where the crash happened. And I don't know if you are familiar with Garmin's or what kind of data they can create. Up above here is the data that we were able to extract from the Garmin. And so the numbers on the far left are every second or two or three, the Garmin takes a snapshot of data. And there's 746 snapshots of data that this got before the crash. It tells you what your elevation is. So if you're coming down a hill, it tells you how many feet you went between snapshots, tells you how many seconds you went between snapshots, tells you what your speed was when it took your picture, tells you what your heading was, which is critical here, tells you the date and time, and then your position on the earth. That heading became important because the defense in the criminal case, this was a case where the guy was driving the pickup here, and he made a turn here. This is an east-west road, sun setting over there in his face. 5 riders are coming this way at him. He says he couldn't see them. He made his turn. And if you remember the picture with the big truck, he was in the wrong lane. I mean, he was turning into this lane, not that lane, when he made his turn. And his expert came in, who was a guy that I know, and I was kind of disappointed that he was in this case because he said there's no evidence that the riders slowed down or did anything to take any kind of evasive action, or they weren't paying attention. And the police had this data and misinterpreted it because we offered our help because we get a lot of these kind of GPS things, and they made statements that were just wrong in terms of what these numbers meant and where on earth they were. And what these numbers show you is, I mean, he's at 33 miles an hour, 4 points back out here. There's a big hill coming down to 33 miles an hour. As he gets down the hill, 35, he gets to 31 here. But what you notice is that column with the directional heading at 31 miles an hour, instead of going due east, he's now starting to drift to the right. Our theory is because within a second or two, this guy is going to make that turn, and then he's 4 more degrees to the right about a second or so before impact. So our interpretation of that data was that he probably realized that the idiot driving the pickup was going to turn left into his path, and he was doing what he could to slow down and get out of the way before he got hit by the truck. So these Garmin's can be very powerful in terms of the data that we can get out of them these days. And then every once in a while, you get lucky. This was a case where the fellow behind the cyclist had gotten a camera for his birthday, like a dash cam. And he put it on the first day, first time out with his brand new dash cam, and this is what he got. It says graphic video. It's not like bones sticking out or anything like that, so I think we'll be okay. A little beetle decides, guy in a beetle decides he's going to run the stop sign, hits him, and our guy gets up, shakes it out, and it turns out he had a compound fracture, and he probably shook it back into place, you know what I mean? So he was lucky there, and he ended up with surgery and a plate, but it could have been probably worse. But he was, there was no doubt about what happened in that case. So we try to find evidence everywhere as best we can. It's kind of what we do that's a little different from what people can do on their own. So if you have a case, you have a crash, call somebody. But by and large, statistically, you're not going to ever need me. So hopefully you never will. But if you call 484-BIKE anytime, I'm happy to chat, talk bikes, talk laws. If you have nationwide for your auto policy and you ride a bike, you have 2 coverages in your typical auto policy that can blossom during a bike crash. Number 1 is the uninsured motorist. We talked about that. The other one is called medical payments coverage. It's a little coverage. It's maybe 1,000, maybe 5,000. Some people have 10. I have a case now with 25, and I had one guy who had $100,000 of State Farm med pay. We call it medical payments coverage. What it is if you're in a car crash and you have medical bills, whether it's your fault, somebody else's fault, whether you're in your car, you're sitting on the bench and the car hops the curb and hits you, as long as there's a car involved, it's to pay your medical bills. Today, under today's insurance plans, people have high deductibles, so we often use MedPay to cover out-of-pockets and deductibles. Nationwide is the only company that I've dealt with, and I've litigated with them on this issue. They say that their policy only applies if you are a pedestrian, meaning you are on foot and not on a bicycle. So I had the case with the GPS with the drunk driver that hit my guy up in Mansfield. He had Nationwide. He had $5,000 in medical payments coverage. He had $20,000 in out-of-pocket bills. We tried to get Nationwide to pay that. They refused, citing this provision. I litigated with them. We settled the drunk driver case for the policy limits, and then I won. I filed a motion for summary judgment, meaning I'm asking the court to grant me judgment without a trial on that issue against Nationwide, and the judge did. So hooray, we win. Nationwide appealed that $5,000 case. They appealed it to the Court of Appeals, and I kind of knew why, because that part of Ohio has a very conservative set of judges, and they tend to be more insurance friendly than plaintiff friendly. And I got to the oral argument, and I made the argument that, well, if he was in a wheelchair, what if he didn't have any feet and he was hobbling along on crutches? What if it's a baby in a baby carriage, or if he's in a wheelchair? And the defense lawyer for Nationwide jumped up and said, oh, if he's in a wheelchair, we'd pay that. And it's like, what's the difference? And it was a 2-to-1 decision against me, favoring Nationwide. And the guy who wrote the dissent cited the wheelchair example from the oral argument and just kind of shrugged. It's like, you're being propelled in some way on wheels. It doesn't matter if you're on a bike. It shouldn't. So anyway, I tell people, don't buy Nationwide. If you're ever going to use them for your bike crash, you may need them. They're very uncooperative. I had another case up in Union County where it was an intentional assault. Pickup truck drivers, a husband and wife. Pickup comes up behind, husband is in the back, cusses the husband out, honks the horn, rolls the window down, F you, blah, blah, blah. And the husband's just head down riding. And he does the same thing to the wife, who's the next one up, and she's giving it right back to him. And then she flips him off. He cuts her off, drives up the road, parks, gets out, and comes, stalking towards her as she's approaching. She goes off the road and then off into the grass as he's yelling at her. Then he hears the husband coming. He turns around, body slams the husband into the truck. And he was insured by Nationwide, and they refused to pay. Not only did they refuse to pay, they filed a declaratory judgment action asking the court to order them that they didn't have to pay. Why? Well, if you are in a bar and you're negligently telling a story and you happen to hit somebody and break their nose, that's a careless incident. If you're mad at somebody and you intentionally punch them in the nose, that's intentional. You don't insure against intentional stuff, typically. And this guy was convicted of assault, felony, crime of violence, felony 4th degree, ended up pleading guilty. And Nationwide said, hey, he pled guilty to assault, therefore we don't owe anything. And we were able to pigeonhole the case into a line of cases with facts saying he may have intended to do something. He didn't intend to break this guy's elbow. That wasn't his intent. And they ended up with a broken elbow. He had $100,000 in medical bills, 2 surgeries, put a plate and screws in. They had to take it out. I mean, it was a real mess. So they ended up paying us at the end because we filed a motion against their attempt to get the case thrown out, and the judge ruled in our favor, and they finally came to the negotiating table. But we fought them for 2 years, tooth and nail on Nationwide on that, so they're pretty aggressive. Yeah. Question?
Difference in traffic laws from the moment you leave a public road and get onto a multi-use.
That's, my argument is, and I pointed out something in one of the early slides that said the traffic laws apply when you're on the highway. That's an important distinction. In Ohio, the definition of the highway is basically the entire right-of-way from the fence to the ditch to the berm to the lane to the fence to the, all the way across. The roadway is the stuff you drive on. And in my continuing legal ed presentation, I do about 30 minutes on what is a roadway, because there's case law all over the place that says either the stuff to the right of the white line is part of the roadway, or it's not, or it might be, or it may be. So you have to pigeonhole. But to your question, let's say you're not on the roadway inside the white lines, you're just to the right of that. Do the traffic laws apply? One section says highway, so you would think they would apply. Some cases say they do apply if you're over there, and some cases say they don't apply if you're over there. So the cases tend to fall along the lines of, how does a bicyclist lose his case? And if it's lost with you applying the laws over there, then they do that. If it's lost when you don't apply the laws over there, then they don't do that. I mean, it's really kind of wild, wild west. So if you're on the berm, my thought is you probably should follow the laws. You shouldn't ride against traffic on the berm. But I can't say that there's a law that says you're not allowed to do that. You can walk that way. In fact, you're ordered under the pedestrian laws, if you're walking and there's no sidewalk, you're supposed to walk against traffic. So there is some precedent there for that. But the law doesn't say that you have to, do that when you're on the other side of the road. And of course, I had a case in Blue Ash with a guy who was 78 years old. He's the guy that had $100,000 in MedPay coverage. He's riding on, it's a big road that goes towards Kings Island. 4 lanes, it's 45-mile-an-hour speed limit, everybody does 70. And so there's like a 6 or 8 foot berm over there. He's riding on that. And this young lady is lost, and she's going to she knows she passed where she has to be back there, so she's going to pull into this little street, do a U-turn, and come back. She sees him. She says in the crash report, I underestimated his speed. He is to the right of the white line. He enters the intersection to go across that intersection, and she clobbers him. Broken hip, $200,000 in medical bills, fractured hip repair, fails, has to have a new hip. I mean, a bad injury case. And the police officer from Blue Ash wrote it up as his fault because he was off the road, and what he should have done, he testified, is to go over to the crosswalk and gone through the crosswalk and gone in there. We were able to show that the white lines that separated the berm from the road ended about 15 or 20 feet before the intersection, and the cars routinely used that space. It was not when he got hit, he wasn't on the berm. He had entered the roadway well before she hit him, so she was halfway into the lane when she hit him. So we didn't have to get to that because they ended up settling that case, but that would have been interesting, a ride through the Court of Appeals on that. I don't know what they would have done exactly. Sometimes it's better to take the money and run. Questions anywhere else? Yep.
In the last few years, highway engineers seem to have fallen in love with roundabouts, and those things are completely incompatible with both pedestrian traffic and bicycle traffic.
I don't disagree.
And, so do you have any suggestions or recommendations other than avoiding them?
I'm okay with single lane roundabouts that are tight. And because you can't go, you're almost making a right turn to get into it, and then it slows traffic down coming into it, or if they have traffic calming before the roundabout. I had a case. It was in Columbus. It was a huge roundabout. It was the size of a football field. There were...
That's a small roundabout. Those ones should be bigger than that.
Yeah, but they slow everybody down. So you're...
The roundabout should be designed so that they can drive through the automobiles can go through there without slowing down. If they don't try to make them that small, then they don't work right.
Well, the problem is when they get too big, and this one had, if you picture north-south traffic, 2 lanes in each one separated, entering and exiting the roundabout, and a 2-lane road entering and exiting on the side. My guy came in the 2-lane, was down here, 2 different lanes are coming towards him. He has a right-of-way now, right? When you're in the roundabout, you have the right-of-way. The guy in the pickup truck who hit him broadside was looking over there because that's where the people coming 50 miles an hour were going to be coming from. And and the guy behind him saw my guy get whacked and get, he was hitting the horn trying to tell the guy, hey, there's somebody right in front of you, and he just popped him and sent him into the next county. So I like the smaller ones better than the big ones, but they're all sort of problematic because you're too close and they're looking behind you for big box-like creatures that can eat them, not, they kind of trample on you if you're in front of them. So I agree. I'm not, statistically they get cars through faster than stoplights, and maybe they cut down on rear-end collisions, but they create hazards, especially for pedestrians and especially for disabled pedestrians. If you can't move fast, if you can't see well, if you're in a wheelchair, now you have to figure out how you're going to cross this lane and get around to that lane, and it can be a real mess. So I'm not a fan, in general. They just put one in Blue Ash here, which I haven't been to yet, but we'll see what that one looks like. Yep.
Seems to be an increasing amount of more going towards autonomous vehicles. I read a story on the internet earlier saying we're just years away from fully autonomous vehicles. Obviously, we're there partially. Have you found that to be the contributing factor at all yet?
It will be, because at this point, no one has convinced us that they can see us and consistently. Now, maybe they can see us better than the car drivers, but they still have a lot of errors when they encounter unexpected things. There was a big crash out in Phoenix, I think, with one of them. They're testing them in Athens. They're testing them in Columbus. So, they're going to be here, before we know it. One thing we have seen is our first e-bike crashing, and whether or not the bike played a role. The one in Warren County was one. There was another one in, it was an Amish young lady on an e-bike, and it just didn't make sense to me because it's a pretty wide road. She's coming this way and made a left turn, like right into the side of a car. And if you've ever ridden an e-bike, depending on what kind you have, if you're pedaling, it's going to shove you along. So you have to kind of know how to feather the brakes and how to stop it from shoving you along. And I suspect maybe that's what happened with her. If you're inexperienced with the way the throttling works on that, you might think, oh, I'm just going to coast, but it's still shoving you at 20 or 25 miles an hour. So that may be, until people get, there's a learning curve to those, and I think we're going to see some crashes until people get hooked into them.
Are you seeing any increase in road rage?
Yeah, significant. I've seen more intentional acts in the last 5 years than in the prior 25 years, probably. Throwing stuff, running people off the road. That's why we try to encourage, if you're going to be on the road a lot, get a camera. I had a what do they call, a rolling coal case a couple of years ago, where we got it on camera, and the state troopers went out and talked to the guy. He said, oh, that's just what my truck does when I accelerate. It's like, I don't think so. You have to tweak your settings, and so that's another more in the country kind of thing. And we're seeing more dogs and dog attacks, particularly in the country, and dog owner attacks. I got a case out of Southwest Ohio where a known kind of angry dog went after a rider, and he came prepared with bear spray, and he was ready to spray it, but he didn't because the dog backed off. And the owner got on a four-wheeler, chased him down, passed him, brake checked him. He hit the back of that, and the guy called the cops to try to get him cited for hitting his four-wheeler, and the cops cited him for assault. So it ended up working out that way. But so we're seeing more of that sort of aggressive. Or there was a crash. I think it was Warren County, where they just don't come to the door. They don't answer the mail. The dog came out and caused a bad crash, and they got a group of 4 or 5 riders are knocking on the door. They know she's in there. She won't come out. And then the police ended up talking to her later, and oh, I didn't know my dog did that. And then I send her a letter, send her another, send her another. It takes 4 or 5 letters to get their attention sometimes. So just kind of callous behavior towards the actions that they've done there. So, anything else? All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much.